So a number of years ago, when I used to have a different job, when I was an engineer, I used to travel all the time. And I spent 6 months, or almost 9 months actually, on this contract, and I would fly weekly back east. And at the time, we lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I remember this conversation I was having with one of the women I was working for on that end. She was a member of our team, but she lived there. And one day we were talking about work stuff, and then she just pauses and stops. And she looks at me, she's like, "I don't understand where you live." And I'm like, "Well, I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico." She's like, "No, I understand that. I just don't understand, like, how you live there, right? Like, what does that even look like?" Because I think in her mind, when she thought of New Mexico, she kind of had this in mind, where it was like, big and open and desolate and, all that sort of stuff. And of course, Albuquerque and New Mexico have that stuff in it. And I'm like, well, we live in an actual, city. They have, we've got Walmart and all this, all this other stuff. And she just couldn't figure it out. She's like, "I don't know what I would do there. I would go crazy. How do you just live in that place?" And then I had this moment of thinking to myself, I'm like, "Lady, you live in New Jersey. We're in New Jersey right now. I've been in New Jersey for 4 months. How do you live here? Like, this is what I don't understand." And so we just agreed to disagree, and that we didn't really understand each other all that well, and it was okay. But I will tell you that my 9 months, commuting back and forth from Albuquerque to New Jersey told me that I never in my life need to live in New Jersey. Which is not, if you're from New Jersey, I'm sorry, I'm sure it's wonderful. And obviously she thought it was wonderful. And she could probably come to Albuquerque for 9 months, and at the end of that 9 months, she would agree that she probably never needs to live in Albuquerque, which is fine by me too. But that's kind of what we're going to talk about today, is this idea that as people, we tend to thrive in certain environments, and those environments are sometimes different from each other physically. I have no doubt there are people who thrive in really urban places. I frankly am not one of those people. But I know there are people who do, and they really enjoy that. And there are people who thrive in really, really rural places. I mean, I'm from eastern Montana, I think, where it doesn't, they actually called it hyper-rural at a certain point, because there's rural like we have here, but you're still only like, an hour and a half from Denver. And then there's the rural that I grew up with, which is you're an hour and a half from the town of 6,000, right? I mean, there's a difference there. And so there's people who love that environment, and they thrive in that environment. And I think it comes down to things like who you are and what you know. So today's story is actually kind of about that. So today's story is The Little House. Had anybody actually heard of The Little House? The one that requested it has heard of it. Okay. So the little house begins like this. Once upon a time, there was a little house way out in the country. And by the way, there's going to be a lot of spoilers for Little House in the sermon. I don't know how to do it without doing that, so I apologize now if I'm ruining this book for you. It's actually a pretty good book. But what ends up happening is over time, the things grow, and this little house, who lived in the country, found itself over time being encroached on by the nearby city, and suddenly it wasn't living in the country anymore, but over time it was living amongst other houses, and then it was living amongst taller buildings, and eventually was living in this very kind of dense urban place. I think that's actually something that some of us around here can relate to. Right? There aren't too many housing developments around this part of the world that you won't see, like that one house that was obviously there for 100 years before all the rest of the houses came. And at one point, that house was the house in the middle of the field, and now it's a house amongst the middle of houses. So that was the plight of this little house. And the problem is that as the city grew up around it and it got busier, and cars and trains and all that kind of stuff showed up, people didn't appreciate the little house in the way that the little house had been appreciated when it was kind of alone by itself out in the country. And the house didn't appreciate being there because you couldn't see the stars, and you couldn't see the fresh breezes, and you couldn't have all those things. And so the house really could not thrive in that environment because the environment didn't understand it, and it didn't understand where it was. Now, of course, this being a children's book, it's got to have a happy ending. as you might expect. And so what eventually ends up happening, and here's the spoiler part if you want to plug your ears, is the granddaughter, or great-granddaughter, of the person who originally built that house stumbles upon it one day as they're walking through the city. And she's like, I think that looks like the house my great-grandfather made. And she looks into it, and lo and behold, it was. So she arranges to have somebody come and look at the house, and they're like, oh, the structure is good, the bones are good. And so, of course, they put it on a truck, like you do, and they drove it out to what then was now the country, like you do, and they put it on a hill where the great-granddaughter could live there with her family. And because the house was back where it belonged, it could thrive again. And it did. And it became a home to this new family. And on the surface, it's a great story. Now, the couple of things I appreciated about the story as I was reading it is the author doesn't go so far as to say that cities are somehow bad. He avoids saying that. And in much the same way the little house didn't belong in the city, I think we'd all be a little weirded out if we were driving through the countryside and suddenly saw a 20-story building in the middle of a cornfield, right? It just doesn't belong there. Somebody's going to send me a picture of that now. I can see this. Somewhere that exists, and it's going to look weird. But he doesn't say that. He just says, but this house wasn't where it was supposed to be, and it wasn't going to be able to thrive until it got back to the environment that it was designed and built to be in, which was not between the skyscrapers, but was out in the country where it felt and it knew that it belonged. Now, today's scripture, believe it or not, has something to do with this. So Psalm 126. So one of the things we've talked about actually the last couple of weeks, this was not intentional, but it just seems to have come up the last couple of weeks, is the exile experience that God's people went through. We talked about it a couple of weeks ago. I think we talked about it last week. And so the exile experience was an experience that happened about 600 BC where God's people were actually carried off into slavery again in Babylon. They had been in the land. They had been in Jerusalem. They had a temple. They had been doing things. They had been there, but they did something that made God mad, and so God carried most of them off to Babylon for a couple of generations. And then, as we talked about last week, there was some concern about going back when they were given the opportunity to go back. But of course, they do go back. They do go back to Jerusalem. They do go back to the place God has called them to be and gave them. And in the psalm that we're reading today comes after that. So when it says in the psalm, it starts off by thanking God, and it thanks God, and it says, God, thank you for when you restored Zion, basically when you brought us back to where we belong. And they talked about how joyful that experience was. And there are several psalms that fall into this category, the post-exile psalms, and oftentimes they express the amount of joy they have for being back where they belong, being back in the place that they understood God wanting them to be. Because there's just something about that feeling, right? It's like that feeling of going home again after you haven't been there for a while. It's the feeling of feeling like you're actually in the space that you are supposed to be in. So they're feeling that. And so the first thing they express in the psalm is they say, thank you, God, for that. But then they come out with, then in the middle part there's something else, though. And it talks about restoring the waters and what's going on. And best we can figure is going on is even though they were in their land, there was some sort of drought or some sort of issue, so they weren't getting the moisture they needed to grow the crops that they needed to eat. So they start off thanking God for saying, thanks for bringing us back here. This is where we belong. But, oh, by the way, it'd be really nice if you could send some rain too. That's basically what they're saying. Because again, at this point, everybody's farmers and everybody needs to grow stuff. Now, I think this is important because it helps us understand something. They're still grateful for being there, but being there doesn't make everything magically perfect, right? Even though they are where they're supposed to be, it doesn't mean that there isn't hard work that has to be done. It doesn't mean there aren't challenges that have to be overcome. It doesn't mean that there aren't going to sometimes be hardships and struggles, right? But it's because they are where they know they're supposed to be, they have more faith and confidence. Not that those things aren't going to happen, but when they do, they can be overcome. So they start with God saying, thank you for bringing us here. Yes, we understand that's where we're supposed to be. Yes, we agree we are supposed to be here. And we're kind of going through some stuff right now. Can you help us out? We're where we're supposed to be. We're doing what we're supposed to be doing, but it's hard right now. Can you help make it a little easier? is basically what they're requesting. And it's not a surprise that this is what they're requesting. Because truthfully, the land that they are in, especially Jerusalem, which is sort of kind of the center of Jewish life at this point, so we're still 600 years before Christ, but Jerusalem is definitely the center of Jewish life. And Jerusalem is interesting because much like Atlanta and Phoenix, Jerusalem should not exist. Because let's be honest, Atlanta and Phoenix should not exist. Right? At least not like they're due, right? There is not enough water there to support either how many people live in either one of those towns, right? There aren't enough natural resources there. They both get in arguments all the time with their neighbors over things like water because they don't have enough, and their neighboring states don't want to give them any. And I know this is one of those things that Colorado feels, because one thing I've discovered right when we first got here is Colorado is a little weird about its water. Literally my first week here, when I said I moved to Montana, somebody asked me where our water went, and I'm like, I don't know, downstream? I've never been asked that question. Nobody's ever cared. Apparently in Colorado we care, and we care a lot. And part of the reasons we care a lot is downstream from us are a lot of things that ought not exist because there aren't enough resources there to support them. So they all have to be brought in, and yet they do exist, right? Because there are other reasons for them existing besides natural resources. Jerusalem is the same way. For basically the 3,000 years of Jerusalem's existence, it has really existed to be a religious center. It's not the best place to put a city. It's not really near any water resources. It's kind of a pain in the butt to build there. It is, on the whole, not particularly prime real estate for kind of the practical day-to-day life. And yet, it has been a religious center for pretty much his entire life. And during the time of the exile and after, it is the place where God's people build the temple and the place that everybody comes and pilgrimages to on a regular basis to offer thanks and to come and to do all of the religious things that they need to do. So Jerusalem may not make a lot of sense in some ways, but in other ways, it makes a lot of sense for what God's people need. Like the little house, God's people needed to be in the right environment to thrive. They couldn't thrive in Babylon, even though some of them didn't want to leave. We talked about that last week. Some of them didn't want to leave because they weren't sure what they were going back to. They didn't want to leave because of that whole idea, better the devil you know than the devil you don't, right? But the truth is they were never going to survive, and they were never going to thrive in Babylon because it wasn't where they were meant to be. And the reason that they know, and they needed to get back from that place, they needed to get back to the place where they did belong. Not because that place was going to be easy to live in, and not because it was going to be free of challenges. In fact, quite the opposite. But because it was theirs, and because it was what they knew of as home, and it was because of who they were, and it's because they really, really understood and felt that God was calling them to be, they were willing to do it. Because here's the thing they were never going to feel in Babylon. The problem wasn't, and actually Babylon was a better place, it was easier to grow food there. The problem is in Babylon they were never going to feel the love that they're going to feel in Jerusalem. And at the end of the day, with my contention, that is probably actually the most important thing about the place where we can survive and we will thrive. The environment that means something to us, the environment where we will be truly everything we are called to be. For some of us, it may be the city. For some of it, may be the country. For somebody, it may be somewhere in between. But I think the common thread that runs through all of those places that really mean something to us and help us to be everything we can be is it is those places where we are able to love and feel loved. We're hitting that time of year. So this is the last Sunday of June. And the last Sunday of June is also the last Sunday of the appointive year in the Methodist Church. We have a lot of years in the Christian church, by the way. We've got the liturgical year, which starts at Advent. We've got the actual year. We've got the fiscal year. We've got all kinds of things. We also have the appointment year. And the appointive year runs July to June. And some of you all know this very well. And so when we get to this point, we get to the last Sunday of June. For many of my friends and colleagues, they are using this Sunday to say goodbye to one church before they say hello to a new church the following Sunday. That's how it works in the Methodist Church. I'm not going anywhere, by the way. Just... I am appointed here for at least another year and probably many more after that. And for those of you who are disappointed, I'm sorry. But what that means is that my Facebook feed and those kind of places, in the circles that I run in and my friends, it's full of pictures of moving vans. It's full of pictures of stories about saying goodbye. It's full of pictures about people coming into new places and new times. And there is something about practice a few years ago that I took up as I would see these announcements coming out. Because you can go to the websites and you can read about them, and it's names and places, but each one of those names is a person. A person who feels like they've been called to do something set apart from others, that they've been called to do something specific for God's kingdom. And then those places aren't just pieces of ground or geography. Those places are communities of people that have hopes and dreams of their own, and a hope and a dream that maybe this new person that's coming to lead them can help them. And so I started this practice years ago where as I would see those things go by, I would pray. And I would pray for when I'd heard about a new appointment. And I would pray for the people who were involved in it. And in the beginning, I used to pray things like I would pray that my friends would be good leaders where they were. I would pray that they would be happy and their churches would be happy. I would pray that they would be successful in their ministry there or something like that. And then a couple of years ago, upon some reflection of my own, I realized I'm not sure that's the right stuff to pray for. And so the thing that I pray for today when I see these people moving into these new communities is I pray that they will find a community there that they can love, and that community there can learn to love them. Is anything else that I would want to see out of my friends and all the success I would wish for them, if we're very honest about it, has to flow from that place. It has to flow from a place where they feel loved and a place where they are able to love back. Because when that is there, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what your role is. If you are in a place where you feel loved and cared for, and a place where you want to show love and care, I don't know what's more important than that. I don't know what's going to be more impactful for that. I don't know what's going to be more meaningful from that. And when things go astray and things go awry, and I hate to break it to you, sometimes things go awry even in the church. We're not perfect. But oftentimes when that happens, one of the things that happens before everything goes awry is the ability to love and be loved starts to break down. So I pray for my friends, and I pray they find a community that they can love, and I pray that the community will find a way to love them back. And in many ways, this is really infitting for us as Methodists, because as you might expect, because he has many, John Wesley has a quote about this. He says, "Though we cannot think alike, may we not love alike. May we not be of one heart, though we are not of one opinion. Without a doubt we may. Herein all the children of God may unite, notwithstanding these smaller differences." The idea of being part of a community isn't to be part of a community that thinks like you do, that only thinks like you do. That's not the point. The point of being in a place where you can thrive and you can grow isn't about being in a place where everybody's exactly the same, or where there are no hardship or are no challenges. That's not the point at all. That's not Jerusalem. That's not the world that God gave God's people. What is true, and what does help us thrive, and what we cannot thrive without, is being in a place where we feel loved, and being in a place where we want to love others. And if we have that, it really doesn't matter if it's in the middle of a cornfield or the middle of the city or the middle of the suburbs or wherever it is. That environment doesn't matter nearly so much as being in a place where we feel loved and we love others. That is our challenge, and that is our task as a church. That is our task as God's people. It was the task of God's people 3,000 years ago. It's the task of God's people today. It's why we come back to it over and over and over again and say it till we're all nauseous of it. We love God, love neighbor, and love ourselves. That's about loving others and feeling loved ourselves. That's what we should strive for here if we truly want to be part of God's kingdom. That's what we should strive for if we really want to call ourselves God's people. And it's not that we're not going to disagree. It's not that we're not going to have, not that sometimes we're not going to face challenges. Not that everything's going to be perfect and sunshine and rainbows all the time. It doesn't mean that. It means that when it's not perfect and the challenges come, we'll get through it. When the disagreements come, we'll get through it with love and thoughtfulness. And when those opportunities to be God's hands and feet come, small and big ways, we will rise to those opportunities. Because when we're in a community where we feel loved and we want to love, there will be more love than we can handle, and we will have to find a way to share it with other people. That is what God's people have been doing from the beginning. It's what Jesus taught us to do. It's what John Wesley taught us to do. It's what we know we're supposed to do. We also happen to know that when we really think about those places that we like to be in and want to be in, that is probably the one thing that's common in there. We want to be in a place where we are loved and feel like we are able to love others. So today, let's do that. Tomorrow, let's do that, and let's moving forward do that. And if we can do that, then we can be like the little house. We'll be like the little house when it finally gets back to that country, it gets back to the country where it belongs, where it can be loved and feel and love others. We can be like the Jews when they got back to Jerusalem, where they got back to the place where they belonged, where they can be grateful to God for the blessings in their lives and have confidence they can overcome their challenges. Because that's who we are, and that is who we are called to be.